Well, as a general thumb rule, when being in the wind alone, for an aero cyclist, around 80% of the resistance will come from the air. So that's a lot. That's the main factor you have in cycling, especially in triathlon, where you are in the wind alone for the race.
Hello, in this episode I have Frederik with me. He's a aerodynamics and performance optimization specialist, and I think it's a pretty important theme and something that is really important to be known about at triathlon, endurance sport, and cycling as well. So to the people who don't know you, Frederik, can you try to put some words on yourself?
Yes, of course. I'm Frederik Muff. I'm 33 years old, working as aero specialist at Fusion, former elite cyclist, and yeah, working with world-class athletes, trying to help them getting better, trying to make them perform even more for the watts that they put in. So that's pretty inspiring and a nice job to have.
Yeah, and you yourself have also been a cyclist previously and have some records in Denmark. I don't know if you can share some numbers on that as well, so people also know that you actually can push and watch yourself and be aerodynamic.
Yeah, I have the Danish record in 10, 30, 50, and 100K time trial. So that's the four that's possible to have in Denmark. So that's nice to have them all, so to speak. And I'm especially proud of the 100K, which was done with almost 52 k's an hour. Under pretty strict regulations, you have to go out and back on the same course, so you can't really obtain anything from a tailwind. You have to be within the UCI limits of the bike setup. So that's a nice one to have, and also work sometimes as sort of a proof of concept. When working in a wind tunnel, it's nice to have the experience from both the optimization of myself, but also have I maybe have the ideas that some of the guys coming in here have as well, and understand the importance of also trusting your equipment, so you're not having any speculations on race day whether you have the fastest possible. So that's nice to have that background, that it adds a bit more for me, and also just knowing the fact that everything is at stake for the guys who are here, how important it is for them to be the fastest version of themselves.
And when did you actually first realize that how much performance on a cycle is due to the aerodynamics, especially a high speed?
I think I've always been a bit of a nerd when it comes to equipment. Always been into trying to optimize whatever was possible. I think I was one of the first guys in the Danish elite who rode every race in a skid suit back in 2013 or so. So I always been trying to push that edge, but in a more scientific way. I think it was from 2019 to 2020 where I started also putting another ad on to my own level, and also starting to do some more aero testing myself, and not just following trends, but more like validating whatever worked. So I think that's for 6-7 years now. I've been working pretty intensely on that part.
Yeah, so you have made lots of tests on yourself, but also elite athletes in the time when you have been working with aerodynamics. So, if just to put you into the hot seat in this case, what is the biggest mistake you have actually made working with aerodynamics on yourself or athletes that you would never make today?
There's a lot, I think, from clothing choices to not trusting the equipment I've made. I think the biggest mistake is probably some of the times where I've changed something just before a big race, which pretty much comes from, I think, being nervous for the big day, wanting to make sure that everything is all right. You do a last minute change, and then after the race you find out that the change actually made it worse for you in terms of aerodynamics. I've done that a few times, so that's not as nice as you could think to be on the other hand of a race, knowing you lost with 5 or 10 seconds, and then knowing that the seconds that you lost were actually from the change you made. So yeah, that's a better one.
Yeah, makes sense. And I think many people that work with aerodynamics some way cycle or do something in endurance themselves, but you have been creating quite some records yourself. So in terms of that, Is this something you have learned riding yourself on a high level and trying to do record attempts within the aerodynamic space on a bike that you couldn't have learned from other riders and testing other riders?
Yeah, I think like the feeling of, for instance, positional changes, how it feels to lower the handlebar 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters, how it feels to lower the saddle. The aspect of comfort in aerodynamics, which is really important, because when testing, it's not that important because the tests are not that long. But when doing, for instance, the 100K time trial, or having to be able to push in the same position after, for triathletes, 180K, for cyclists after maybe a bit shorter, but still being able to push the watts in the position, I think that's a learning that comes from trying it on yourself. So also like the feedback from the athlete gets more, I would say, real in some point, because I have a sort of a feeling on how it feels. And when they say it's not sustainable for them that we lower, for instance, the handlebar a bit, it's more understandable, and then it's easier to have the feeling that, okay, I know how it feels to push it too far, and then we have to find a compromise. So I think that's the main thing. That's, having tried to make all the changes on myself, that's a good thing to have today.
Yeah, makes really good sense. So how much does the aerodynamics actually matter for an average cyclist? Let's say it's not like amateur or professional level, but below that. How much do you think aerodynamics is something that these people should be looking into and work with?
Well, as a general thumb rule, when being in the wind alone, for an average cyclist, around 80% of the resistance will come from the air. So that's a lot. That's the main factor you have in cycling, especially in triathlon, where you are in the wind alone for the race. So it makes a lot. Depending on the level, comfort, sun protection, compression, some of the other parts also makes a difference. But aerodynamics is the main thing, and that's a thing you have to be aware of, whether you're riding 30 km per hour or 50 km per hour. But of course, there's like an increase in the importance the faster you ride. But it's still around 80%, and maybe 35, 37 km per hour. So that's a lot even at lower speeds.
Yeah, so you actually answered on my next question a little bit, but when do the aerodynamics start to be really significant, do you see normally?
I think at around maybe 25 km per hour, the importance is really big, or starts getting bigger. You will have an aerodynamic impact on lower speeds as well, whether it's on climbing, actually on running. There's also an aerodynamic aspect that's often not that focused on today, but there is it is important even at lower speeds, but from 25, 28, maybe 30 km per hour, it gets one of the main factors, whereas it's more like a part of the equation in the lower speeds.
Is that also why we, in the different Grand Tours, see the top athletes like Tadej Pogacar and Jonas Vingegaard and so on using more aero bikes and high frames in the wheels as well, because they're riding so fast uphill?
Yeah, but also because of the downhills, where it really gets important. But yeah, I think the bike industry has gone through a big revolution the last couple of years, from going on with the manufacturers trying to make like an aero bike and a lightweight bike. They try to combine that thing today because they know it doesn't really make sense to have a light bike only. And with the new carbon composites, it's easy to make a bike that's within the UCI rules of weight even and being aero. So that's also why, because you have the opportunity to have a 6.8 kilo bike, which is the minimum weight in the races, and still have it as a full aero bike.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes really good sense. So now you also talked into the drag things of being a cyclist. Where does the most drag normally come from? Is it the rider, the bike, the wheels, the glove, or the position? What do you usually see where most of the drag comes from in the wind tunnel when you work at Fusion?
Definitely the body. and the position. That's the main thing. And you can't say position without saying helmet and the interaction between position and helmet. And you can't really say position and helmet without saying suit. So you have to look into the different things, because a different position and a different helmet will divert the flow in a different way over a suit. So you have to think of it more like a system. But if you are coming in from scratch, it's your first time optimizing, you will find the biggest gains in changing position or trying things out in the position. That is the main part. So that will always be the things that you start off with. And then normally it would make sense if you have the time to do some positional changes and then correlate them with different helmets. And then maybe choosing a pretty standardized suit for that, so that doesn't make that big of an impact. And then you can, after trying to figure out what's the fastest position, what's the best helmet to that, start working into getting the suit in as well. But definitely just from shrugging the shoulders a bit, lowering the head a bit, you can see pretty big changes, and also changes that's way bigger than what you will see from changing from normal wheels to deep section wheels, or from normal frame to aero frames.
Yeah, makes sense. So of what I heard, it would be like the position and the person, of course, is the first step, and then the helmet, and then all the other stuff come after that, right?
Yeah,
makes sense. If you have someone that actually have like 1,000, 2,000 euros to spend on making their bike faster, or biking faster is the goal, where should they normally spend it, do you think?
I think it depends a bit on where you are today. I think a lot of athletes go out and buy deep section wheels, also because they look nice and fancy, and bling is also part of sports. But for instance, the difference between maybe high deep section wheel and more entry level wheels can be less than the difference between having tires with perfect rolling resistance and tires with bad rolling resistance in terms of what you gain. So I think if I had 1,000 euros, I think the main thing I would spend them on would maybe be to try to have an aero cockpit that would work around having a comfortable aero position that I could keep for the race. I think that'd be one of the first things. And then really easy gains, calf sleeves, for instance, if doing triathlon, which is a low cost per what you save, and then a nice suit. And then, of course, you don't have to spend that many money, but by having like some kind of aero bar system that works for you, and having a nice suit and a nice pair of calf sleeves, you can work around with the position. And then if you have a bit more to spend, or if you can lend a good helmet, I think that would be nice to have as well.
Yeah. You mentioned the wheels as a place where you normally wouldn't spend it. Is there any more places where you wouldn't spend the money if you want to be faster? As the first things, of course.
Yeah, if you have a pretty nice frame, I wouldn't spend many money on having a newer or more optimized frame. It's rarely that you see that big of a difference between frames. Of course, you can see it, and you can also see it when testing in the wind tunnel. You can like change the yaw angle of the rider, change the speed of the wind. So of course you can find scenarios where you see bigger changes, but like overall, you don't see that much of a change between frames. And I think the last part that I would ever spend money on would be upgrading from a mid-range gearing system to a high-end gearing system. For instance, going from Shimano Ultegra to Dura-Ace, or going from SRAM Force to SRAM Red, because in terms of performance optimization, of course, Dura-Ace is nice. It's maybe a bit quicker in the shifting. It's a bit more lightweight, but it doesn't make that much of a difference. So that's more for the feeling of it than it is from the real performance gain of it.
Yeah, and it's the marginal gain. So weight is important when you're climbing, of course, or into a sprint, but it's so few grams you're saving here in general. Cool. Diving into the theme of testing elite athletes, you have been working with many big athletes like Mathias Manu Stidlev in SAM. And what is the biggest difference when you're testing with people that are amateurs or not like pros, and those who are actually high level in terms of elite and doing this full time?
I think the biggest difference is in the willingness to try new things out. that the higher level you are at, the more open you are to trying new things out, which also comes from you have to do some radical changes to find gains when you are a top pro and have been a top pro for some years and been in the top deck of the sport for that time. But every time we're testing with top athletes, whether it's who's a world record holder or if it's Skjelmose who's preparing for the tour and the time trial there, when we're suggesting something to test with them, the answer is always, let's try it out, let's find it out, let's see if it works. And I think that approach to changes is what makes them special as well, because they are not reserved in staying in the position they are in. They're constantly ready to try things out to see if it works better. They're also realistic, so sometimes they will also say that doesn't work for me, but they are always open to try things out. And I think that what differs them is that they have that willingness to find new gains.
And it's like 99% the same when you're testing elite athletes from cycling primarily also to triathlon, is like the mentality about testing.
Yeah,
makes
definitely
sense. When you test elite athletes, of course, they're always super optimized, but they're always working to find the last gains over the full course, of course. Have you ever tested someone where you actually thought this guy or girl is really aerodynamic as how there is right now?
Yeah, it happens. It also happens that we have testing sessions where we have athletes flown in from almost across the world, so to speak, and we've been not finding that many gains, which is both good and bad. I think the good part of it is that we are confirming that the setup works and that they really have a solid setup, which can also be like nice for them to know that what they're coming with works. But yeah, it happens sometimes that we don't find that big gains. It also happens that we find bigger gains than we expected. So of course, in average, we will also find we will always find something on someone. So I've never been to a full test where we don't find a conclusion that makes them faster in the end. But I think there's a really big difference in it. But I think that's also due to the approach that we try to take a really scientific approach. It's not about finding the gains. It's more like we could always find some gains if we wish to. Slamming the handlebar, putting them into an unnatural position, doing that one run with the wind and a speed that makes them fast in that position or in that case. But we're always trying to find the gains that also correlates to the real world. So yeah. I think from that approach, sometimes you have days where you find not that much. I've myself spent, I think last year I spent like 2 days in the winter on not finding anything. but after doing that, I knew that it's not faster for me to go with this chain catcher. It's not faster for me to choose the helmet. So like, I didn't find any gains, but it made me more comfortable and more secure about the choices that I made, which also gives something on race day. So that can also be the quality of not finding anything.
Yeah, give confidence, and that's also really a big part in the mentality when you're an athlete, that the things you are doing is at least the best way to do it right now, and then you can always get better over time. What is the biggest gain you have ever seen on an elite athlete when doing the aero optimization, which is also relatable to the real world? So not just slamming down the handlebars as you're just talking about, but something that is actually relatable into the real world.
I think we've seen like plus 25, 30 watts on some. And I think it's often from changing from a helmet that doesn't work at all to changes to one that works really well. That's a really big gain. If that's a single gain, because we've also seen sometimes that we have tested, for instance, bike setup versus bike setup. So taking a new version of a bike, comparing it to an older version of the bike, where the new version of the bike sometimes has been faster, sometimes slower. But we've always also seen with especially one guy. I don't know if I can say that much about the test, but I can say that he's a world record holder in triathlon, so people can maybe figure out who it is. where we found a really big gain from changing from the old bike he had to the new bike. But that was not just because of the bike, that was also because of the systems that were around the bike. The bolts were placed a bit different, the stack were a slight difference. So that was more like from one system to another, and there you can find pretty big gains. But like from one thing, I think that would be the helmet. That's the biggest one.
What is the weirdest or most unexpected aero discovery you made?
I think it was we tried once to test with a normal cycling jersey over a speed suit when we were developing a new speed suit, and we found a gain from changing to the cycling jersey, putting it over the speed suit, which made us wonder what is happening. We couldn't really figure it out. But what we found out was that the material on the new on the jersey's torso was so much faster that it actually made sense to use that for the whole speed suit, and then the speed suit overall got faster again when changing that. But that's the nice thing sometimes about having a wind tunnel, that we have the opportunity to try things out. Sometimes just to putting a jersey over, see what happens. Then we get a number, and then we can try to find out whether we can apply those findings to something that's actually usable in the real world.
So I don't know if you can get into the numbers, but what was the difference from the skin suit versus the jersey, and then you recreated the skin suit to a higher level in terms of performance?
It wasn't more than like a couple of watts, as I remember. But the thing was that the jersey was with a different sleeve material. So we had like a prototype jersey, a prototype skin suit. The prototype jersey was thought to be like a more entry-level jersey, which meant that the sleeves on it shouldn't be that well working at the speeds we were testing at. But then the torso material was a bit different because it was a bit more comfy. But apparently that was also faster. So that made us change a bit in the correlation there. So sometimes you are finding things that you wouldn't expect. It could also be, I think another thing that was not expected was the fact that the sizing of the rain jacket was so different, and the fastest config was not necessarily the tightest. The fastest config was more of having like a rain jacket that was well fitting but still a bit loose. But then if it got a bit looser again, it got really slow. So it was like the compromise of finding it and also finding the stretch of the materials where it works the best. And that's what we normally do. Then when testing like overstretched materials, we get an idea what happens with them there. And then we can like apply them to the different patterns and different sizing profiles of the products that we know that this material have to be stretched like 5% to be most aero. Then we like take that into account when doing the size guide, that we stress this 5% in a large, medium, small. So when buying a large, and if you are a size large, it would stretch around 5%.
Makes sense. Makes really good sense. So maybe moving into the wind tunnel, I guess most people or most cyclists or triathletes don't know anything that happens inside a wind tunnel and what is actually happening. I don't know if you can put us into the situation, into the fusion wind tunnel. What is actually happens here when an athlete walks in?
We have what's called a closed circuit wind tunnel with an open test section, and the air circulates around by 4 big fans that generates air. And we can like generate air from 1 meter per second up to around, I think it's 23. That's the maximum right now. We could generate more, but we have limited it to 23, which correlates to just over 80 k's per hour. So it's such a high speed that you wouldn't really see that much of that speed in any race situation. But it's nice to have like the gearing so we can test at high speeds if we wish. Then the bike is mounted at the floor. So like instead of having quick release, you have some stanchions in. You mount them on the floor, and then beneath the floor there is some instrumentation that measures how much you are pushed back by the wind. So we can like in a really precise manner, due to we have different instrumentation that does it. for instance, create a wind of 50k per hour or 45k per hour or 40k per hour. And then we can measure how much is the bike pushed back by the wind with the rider on, and also just the bike itself if we wish that. And then we have a camera that's filming the rider, and the rider can see himself or herself on the floor from a monitor. So it's easy to maintain the same position test after test. And then we change one thing at a time normally. So we would never change wheel, suit, helmet position in one roll, because then we don't know what the gains or losses are coming from. So we do one thing at a time, and doing a pretty systematic work of trying to isolate what happens when we does this, and then we get an idea of what works for them.
Yeah, it makes really good sense. And this is also how you're generating a baseline, I guess, in terms of making sure that the things are more or less the same every time in terms of position and stuff.
Yeah, and we always get back to the baseline. So we see if there's any drift, and it's pretty encouraging to work with this one, because first of all, our wind tunnel is creating the same baseline values day after day, and also month after month. So it means that if we test an athletes in January and they come back, for instance, in August, and they haven't changed anything on the bike, we get more or less the same baseline, which is nice, because then we know that the instrumentation works across the year and across the days. But we always go back to the baseline sometimes throughout the day, because we have to make sure that anything haven't drifted, or that the rider hasn't been in the perfect same position, and that also gives us an idea of the repeatability. Because if we see that the baseline differs with 5 or 7 watts, then we know that the rider on the bike is pretty much not repeating as good as he or she could. Yeah. And then we have to take that into account, because if the difference between two baselines are 5 watts, it's hard to conclude that a gain of 2 watts would be a gain of 2 watts. And then we have to do more testing of that scenario to make sure that it also is representative.
Do you have the possibility to test different things where you're drafting behind the rider as well, or isn't that possible into this wind tunnel?
It would be possible. We haven't done that much, but we could do set up like it if we wish in the future. And I think the idea of this wind tunnel is that now it's built, it's been used every day, but I think it's never finished. I think the idea of it is also finding out, okay, we want to have this that could replicate how it is to be in the pack in a bike race. We have to replicate this. We want to build this that makes us do this or that. So I think that's a constant process of trying to optimize and find new things that it could be worked into the workflow.
Cool. How exactly are the measurements normally into the wind tunnel when you're testing for the different things?
It's pretty precise. We have precision down to 0.1 watts, which is more precise than whatever could be replicated on a human, because just by getting off and on the bike, being within 1.1 watts would be pretty important. Pretty impressive. So we have a really high precision, but that's also because when we have that high of a precision, we know that we can measure 1 or 2 watts in difference. Whereas if the lowest point in measurement would be 1 watt, it would be hard for us to find the small gains. So the precision is really, really, really high, and it's higher than what we actually need, but it gives us the opportunity to be precise in whatever we are testing in the spectrum that we need.
There's many different companies, of course, that are doing wind tunnel tests on clothing and use it as a badge on the clothing as well and all the stuff. Is it actually possible to game the wind tunnels, or cheat the wind tunnel in terms of what you're testing to get better results?
It's pretty easy.
Yeah.
That's
how can that's it be
most
done?
that's the most easy part, because first of all, in the wind tunnel, there's a big difference in how materials work in different speeds. So the fastest material at 30 km per hour is not the fastest material at 40 or 50. And there's also a big difference in how different material works at different yaws, so to speak. So how the rider is angled into the wind. So I think it would be pretty easy for me to find a scenario where, if we call it product A, is faster than product B. And also a scenario where it wouldn't be false marketing to say that it maybe is 5 watts faster than product B. But the problem is that if that scenario is 30 k's an hour and you're doing a time trial skin suit and it's 5 watts slower at 40 and 50 k's per hour, it's not really, it's more false marketing than it is a true story. So you have to think of a wind tunnel as a tool, but it's a tool that you have to use in the right way to get the real answers. And I've seen a lot of claims on the internet. We're not normally claiming that product A is 5 watts faster than product B, because it's impossible to say, because it depends on body shape, position, rider type, bike, cockpit, helmet, everything. So we are more saying that when launching a product, we're maybe testing at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different body shapes, different riders, different positions, and then when launching it, we know that it consistently performs better than the previous product on these riders, which makes us pretty sure that it's a faster product. And I think that's more the marketing thing. We want to say that we're not launching any product that hasn't been tested throughout different body shapes, different positions, different speeds, and I think hopefully in a nearby future that will be the new golden standard of the industry, because it's much better for the customers as well, because they're not getting any false claims that can be backed up in the real world.
Makes sense. So when maybe diving back to elite athletes, when you're testing them and you're seeing some results, do you repeat it 2, 3, 4, 5 times before it's trusted, or how do you normally do this?
It depends a bit. We are almost always repeating some things, but it also depends on the difference. If we test, for instance, the 2 helmets, and one helmet is 20 watts faster than the other, I would be pretty confident to say that whatever we test again, it will still be faster. And then I think it's more looking into the tendencies to see that A is faster than B. Okay, if it's 20 watts faster, then we're pretty sure that it's faster, even though we repeat it again and it only shows 18 watts or 16 watts or 15 watts. So it depends, I think, a bit of what we wish to achieve. Also, if there's any scenario that makes it important for us to do it again. For instance, small differences, big changes to the suits, big changes to material, things that are really important for them to get right. We do repeats again, and we almost always do like a fastest config repeat as well. So trying to stack up the gains that we found in one test as well, to see if it works with each other. And then of course the other part is that we're very keen into doing some outdoor validation with instrumentations as well, to make sure that whatever is found in the wind tunnel also is faster in the real world.
Makes really good sense. And in terms of the real world, I don't know if you know the specific answer to this question, but why does the headwind hurt so much more than the tailwind helps you when you're on riding on a bike?
I think it comes down to like the overall wind speed that you're meeting. If you're doing 30 k's an hour and you're hit by 15 k per hour headwind, you are actually having a wind speed that correlates to 45 k's an hour. If you're doing 30 k's an hour, maybe then you do 40 k's an hour in a 15 k tailwind, then the wind speed that hits you is 25 k's per hour. And given the fact that in aerodynamics, an increasement of wind speed gives an exponential rise in aerodynamic drag, the higher wind speed will always be harder than the lower wind speed. So it's more down to that you don't really gain that much. You don't really gain the loss by also doing the part in the tailwind that you have in the headwind, which is also why it makes sense when looking into pacing strategies to invest in the headwind because it's one of the places you can do the biggest difference.
Yeah, because the consequence is bigger there, basically, in terms of time loss, I guess. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
And does the optimal position change depending on the wind angle in terms of if it's straight headwind or a bit of a crosswind and headwind, or how do you normally look at this?
Normally, it's more or less the same, but we always validate in different angles to make sure that whatever we found in one angle also works in the others.
Makes sense. How important is the yaw angle when you're choosing the wheels in terms of riding in the wind?
It's important because you have to take into account that you will meet different scenarios in the real world than you will in the wind tunnel, and you have a more turbulent wind flow in the real world. So it's important. And that's, I think, you can test wheels in a wind tunnel, and you will test wheels in a wind tunnel, but I would always take the wheels in an outdoor test as well and validating them because it's just a different flow profile.
Makes sense. How do you think amateur cyclists should think about Aero when riding in the windy roads? Should they use lots of time to understand how the best position is, or should they just focus more about the training and then work more on the position later on?
I think a combination. I think training in the position, looking less on the power meter, looking more into how can I be efficient in a compact aerodynamic position is really important. I think a lot of cyclists has an tendency to look a lot at the power meter and try it when doing intervals, for instance, to do, let's say, 300 watts, and then the most important thing is doing 300 watts, whether you're standing or sprinting in the end, or just trying to have that average. I think it would be much better to do 280 in a compact position. That's probably 20 watts faster than the upright position or more. And then being used to that, because that's also part of being fast, that you are able to sustain the position that needs training and adaptation.
Makes sense. And in terms of drafting, I asked about this previously as well, but how much does the equation of the aerodynamic change normally when you're drafting behind a rider in a headwind or no wind for that matter?
It changes a lot because you're sheltered. So in the second position, it's less important than in the first. In the third, it's even less, and then so on, so to speak. There's been like different studies from 9 to wind tunnel into it, how much it is, but drag can be reduced by maybe 50%, even more in the middle of the pack or lower down in a pace line. So it changes a lot, and it makes it less important, of course, which is also why in the Spring Classic, for instance, it's maybe not. It seems a bit counterintuitive sometimes that the favorites are riding in long sleeve jackets and so in the start, but if they're sheltered in the pack, it maybe not make that much of a difference.
No, makes sense. How much does the size in front of you? Of course, a bigger rider gives more like cover, but in terms of the size of the rider behind it as well. But is it like 50% decrease if the rider is lower than you on the bike, or how does this normally look in terms of riding on the real roads?
I think it's hard to say like that. It's so many percent faster or slower. It depends on a lot of things. Wind angle, position, size of the rider. But of course, the bigger the rider, the less you have to overcome when you are in second position.
Makes sense. I will try to round this off with some quick questions, and the focus, of course, aerodynamics, and you can only choose one of these A or B questions. So if it was you, would you pick deep wheels or lightweight wheels?
Deep wheels.
Aero helmet or aero socks?
Aero helmet.
Aero bike or a 1 kilo lighter bike?
Aero bike.
Aero position or a more flexible position?
Aero position.
Skin suit or jersey plus beeps?
Skin suit.
Aero socks or shaved legs?
That's a tough one. Probably shear flex.
50 millimeter wheels or 80 millimeter wheels?
Can I say 60?
Of course.
Then I say
Narrow
60.
tires or wider tires?
Depends on the rim.
Makes sense. What is one piece of aero equipment you would never ride without?
Skin suit.
What is the most overrated aero product in the market?
Aero gloves, I think.
What is the biggest aero gain possible from under 100 euros?
Socks or calf sleeves.
What is the biggest mistake amateur cyclists make in terms of aerodynamics?
Thinking that it doesn't matter.
If you could make yourself 10% more aerodynamic tomorrow, what would you change as the first thing?
I think I would try to shrink from being 195 centimeters to maybe being 175.
Makes sense. Thank you so much for joining into this episode, Frederik.
It was nice. My pleasure.